Hello everyone and welcome to Chop and Brew. I am Chip Walton. Today is important for at least two different reasons. The first of which, it's Charlie Papazian's birthday. That's right, January 23rd, the birthday of Charlie P, the man. So Charlie, wherever you are, I hope you're having a great day filled with brew and chop, friends and family. The second reason today is important is also related to Charlie Papazian, and that is because this here episode of Chop and Brew is a live Q&A that I was lucky enough to take part in last year's Homebrew Con here in Minneapolis with Charlie Papazian and Tom Dalldorf of the Celebrator Beer News. The AHA asked me and Tom to kind of non-scriptedly interview Charlie Papazian, and what came out of it was an amazingly fun 45-50 minute conversation where Charlie just kind of talked about everything. I mean, we talk about how he got into homebrewing, how he first wrote instructional guides, and how he ended up writing The Joy of Homebrewing, and how the feds infiltrated some of his early classes in Colorado. He talks about how ridiculously simple his brewing setup still is to this day. He still brews. And he also talks about just like the social network. And he's got this great line where he's like, beer was kind of the first social network. The social network that you create through homebrewing, through craft beer, through not only just learning and getting more educated, but also just enjoying and sharing. So real quick note, shout out to the AHA for letting us borrow this video first and foremost. But unfortunately the audio was kind of a little off kilter, so whenever Tom is talking, unfortunately you can't really hear him, so the questions that he asked are kind of subtitled on screen. Huge apologies about that. I didn't actually shoot it, I'm just borrowing the video, but huge thanks to AHA for sharing this period, because what you can hear from Charlie is amazing stuff, really great history, and just a look into the mind of Charlie Papazian. A quick note, you can find not only the seminars from last year's Homebrew Con, but many past year's conferences by going to homebrewersassociation.org, clicking on the Let's Brew section, and then conference seminars. Sit back, relax, grab a pint, relax, don't worry. Have a homebrew while you enjoy a Q&A with the one and only Charlie Papazian. We're going to get into it. This is kind of a live interview, as it says in the title, called Homebrew Disrupts American Beer. I'm Chip Walton. I also produce a web show called Chop and Brew, so I feel like they maybe thought I was worth coming in for the homebrew side. All the way to the end of the table, we have Tom Dalldorf of the Celebrator Beer News. Excellent publication. There's some up here if you want to grab one. Tom will introduce himself a little further in a moment, and then in the middle there's this guy some of us know, Charlie Papazian, Charlie P. Give it up for Charlie P. It ain't that early, come on. So we're just going to this is not scripted, this is just kind of ad-lib, freestyle. We're just going to kind of talk about the state of homebrew beer from both sides, craft beer, homebrew, home drink.
Well, yeah, I was introduced to home brewing when I was a student at the University of Virginia, and a friend of mine who lived in a nearby neighborhood introduced me to his neighbor, who was an old timer and brewed during Prohibition, and certainly his recipe that we tried his beer we said, hey, this is pretty interesting. I didn't know you could make beer. Just like all of us, how we started and how we discovered the idea of making homebrew. And I got a recipe that was about 4 lines on a 3x5 card. 1 can of blue PBR malt extract, Pabst Blue Ribbon malt extract, 8 pounds of sugar, yeast, water, stir, cool, ferment, bottle. Oh yeah, it was actually on the malt extract cans and jars that they sold in those days came with a little recipe pamphlet on how to make muffins with a hop-flavored malt extract. Yeah, right. You ever tasted muffins made with hop-flavored malt extract? I'm not going to convince your kid to eat that stuff. I can guarantee you. I made some decent homebrew with my roommates in college, and we used to have some of these amazing parties. And all of us would notice that the ambiance at parties with homebrew was very different than the keggers down the street of the campus, streets of the campus. And then after, make a long story short, after I left the East Coast and moved out to Colorado, wandering around, not knowing what I was going to do, thinking that, well, I left all my homebrew equipment back on the East. I was going to pursue other endeavors, and then someone mentioned that they had learned that I knew how to make beer, where I teach a beer making class, and that was the beginning of where we are right now. Whoa. I started teaching beer making classes, and I observed that people who took the class were both men and women, and they were in search of good beer, and the enthusiasm and the discussions that we had and the camaraderie and the community that came together over the 10 years that I was teaching home brewing was really something special. Just as we all observed, through the home AHA and through our local homebrew clubs and through gatherings at local breweries, that the community of people that kind of seem to get attracted to good beer those communities are really special. And that's kind of what kept me going, really, was a diversity of interests and where people came from, and right politics, left politics, industry people, blue collar people, doctors, PhDs, airline pilots, teachers, nurses, you name it. They were all, there was a bond that we all had, and beer was kind of really lubricated the relationships. Literally. Yeah, it was something very, very special. And we were in a time when there wasn't much information out there, so we were forced to share. I don't think that we were forced. It was just a natural thing to do. That's how we learn. Because when I started teaching beer making, I didn't know shit about beer making. I learned by doing.
Used to, not know.
Yeah. A number of people in here that probably remember what it was like. It was, 69 cents 6 packs of the cheapest beer you could buy as far as being a college student, and not really paying attention to what we were drinking, which still exists today when you're kind of first being introduced to beer, but it's a different world. You have the opportunity to branch out. But what it was is continuing consolidation of the beer industry and predictions, very strong predictions, certainty that it was predicted that certainly the beer industry in those days would consolidate to 1 or 2 people, which basically it has done, the big part of it. But thank God for craft brewers and home brewers that disrupted things.
Wow, hence the disruption in the title of this.
Right. Well, I was thinking about that. In those early days, they didn't use the word disruption. I mean, disruption is kind of a business term these days, and turning things topsy-turvy and figuring out ways of making businesses work, whereby in different ways and different philosophies and different approaches. In those days, we were simply called revolutionaries. That's, or hippies or whatever. If you did something out of the ordinary, you were tagged with a name. And if you're doing something ordinary these days, you're tagged with another name, So being out of the box sometimes reaps good things. There was no internet, there was no email, there was the social network called beer that existed for centuries, and it was word of mouth, certainly word of mouth, literally, because the way we communicated in those days was either by putting a stamp on an envelope and sending something to somebody, or getting on the telephone. and talking and inviting and turning people on one beer at a time. And, you know, it oftentimes people view home brewing and craft brewing and microbrewing, call it what you want, as, you know, people all of a sudden discover it and it's been so successful and it's like an overnight success. Well, it was, you know, it was decades in the making and one beer at a time, and it was all these little social networks of homebrew clubs were very, very, very integral in, you know, spreading the word. And gatherings such as that. Well, I was doing it before. I know I was teaching beer. Yeah, I was a rebel, a revolutionary. You know, I was going against the grain. It was illegal, and I remember at one point, the registrar for the what we call the community free school in Boulder, Colorado, said, "Hey, you know, there's this guy that's registered in your class. He looks a little bit suspicious. We suspect he might be from a government agency, the ATF in those days." And so I was put on alert, and this was in the mid '70s, way before legislation that legalized homebrew, and I was. My class was quite popular. I was featured in newspaper stories and on television news pieces even before homebrewing was legalized. And this one class started, it was about usually four or five sessions of classes once a week for 5 weeks is how I managed it. And the first class, you know, the usual array of men and women would come and sit on my living room floor, and we'd talk about beer, and I'd introduce the basics of beer, and then we start brewing. We brew beer in every class. And this one guy showed up, and he kind of, this is like in the mid-'70s in Boulder, Colorado, and we're sitting on the living room floor, and this guy shows up in his black slacks and a white shirt and a skinny black necktie. Buttoned up, yeah, he stuck out like a sore thumb, I tell you that.
Hello, fellow beer lovers. How are things? Speaking to the mic.
Yeah.
But was he legit or was he?
He was.
Okay.
He was the ATF guy.
Oh.
I'm sure he was. He never.
Legit the other way.
Yeah, but I just emphasized to people, you know, I said, you know, homebrewing is illegal. But the feds probably have better things to do than arrest homebrewers. So keep it to yourself, and by all means, don't sell it. And so that was my little precursor. And he participated.
The shaming thing seemed to work with him?
Well, he participated. He stirred the pot. He was right in there asking questions, all these yeast, beer, malt questions, and hop questions, and he was drinking on the job too. So.
Entrapment Amber Ale. Nice. I wanted to ask kind of off of both of these last two things, the disruption and kind of the struggle and the fight. Recently, obviously in the last couple of years, but last 6 months, between acquisitions, AB and Bev taking over not only breweries, but retail and websites, it feels like the struggle is suddenly ramping up. But the struggle has been there since day one, as far as craft and homebrew really having to fend for itself, justify itself, and support itself, and not let itself get shamed or red taped out of the scene.
Yeah, there have always been people that really put down homebrewing and homebrewers and what they were trying to accomplish. You know, the beer culture and the beer market, call it what you want, was controlled by the big brewers. Distribution was controlled, retail was controlled, and that's, you know, you still have those threats today. It's the way big companies are, despite their friendly commercials and their what they say.
Yeah.
They are. They do what they do, and there's a place for their products and their beers for people who make that choice. But what I've always emphasized is learn, educate, yourself about what the choices are out there and how to make beer, not only how to make beer, but how to taste beer and, you know, what the differences are and who's behind the beer and why they're making it, and make a decision yourself based on what you've learned, and don't rely on commercials, which was what the beer culture was 100% all about back in the 70s. It's like the beer was pushed on you and you bought beer based on television commercials. Where are we going? Well, the big brewers are established, and you know, there's two ways to look at this thing. Well, several ways to look at this thing. In 20, 30 years ago, we used to complain and moan and get angry about the beers that the big brewers were making. You know, we would say, why can't they make a decent beer? And that's what drove us to homebrewing. Really, that's what drove us to homebrewing, because even imports in those days were very limited. There was maybe a shell. If you went into a store, you'd find 5 or 6 imports, and they were usually from Mexico or the Netherlands, Holland. It was Heineken, a few Mexican imports, and maybe St. Pauli Girls or Beck's, and Guinness. That was about it. You could, you know, count the number of imports on your hands. But they are established, and they finally figured out that they want to participate in the more flavorful beer market. But where are we going with this is that they are using old school tactics and philosophies and approach to the beer market in presenting and producing these beers. So while they are certainly better, more interesting, more flavorful beers than we were used to back in the 70s and 80s, if they would be a bit more transparent about who they are and who's behind the beers, that would probably sit okay with a lot of us revolutionaries and disruptors and people who are fully supportive of more local beers. Yeah, well, my book evolved from the teachings of my beer class. The first handouts that I had were basically a 6-page handout that I would give to my class, and that served as the basics of brewing. And then in the mid-'70s, I wrote the Joy of Brewing, and self-published a 78-page booklet. I guess you'd call it a booklet these days, but it was a book for me. And it was a little bit more of an expansive essay on the basics of brewing. And then in 1982 or thereabouts, I somehow miraculously, got a contract with Avon Books out of New York City to publish. They were going to publish my proposed Complete Joy of Home Brewing. And once I signed that contract, I said, "Oh, I better learn some things here." But by that time, I had traveled to the UK for the first time, and I observed. That was really an epiphany for me, because here we were using homebrew books that were mostly published in the UK, and they were pretty primitive procedures, and they were what I learned, the information was not quite accurate, and it was not really science. For example, most of the homebrew books referred to brewing beer in fermenting in a couple of week process, bottling it, and letting the beer age. The longer, the better. Okay? And the epiphany for me was going to the UK, where a lot of these British homebrew books were being published, and talking to brewers and visiting breweries and seeing what they were doing and realizing, hey, they're making beer today and they're serving it in the pub 10 to 12 days later, and it tastes great. And it really struck me, particularly with stouts, because stouts in all the homebrew books had this, that's the stuff you really had to age in order for it to get good. Well,
get darker.
There was some logic to that in the homebrew books, because in the homebrew books, you were told to boil the black patent malt with the wort and the hops. So you did have to age it, but that's not the way it was really being brewed at Guinness, which I visited, and I saw these giant tons, and they were serving the beer 10 days later across the street, and it was delicious. So, and that with also some friends that I had made at the Coors Brewing Company and visiting their pilot brewery, I just listened. I'd listen, observe, and with my, I guess you might say, my engineering background, my engineering education, my task was to translate all this big brewery information and technology and process down to a very practical level for 5-gallon homebrewers. That was my whole thinking when I and making it legitimate science and getting good results and keeping it simple, and also at the same time, and you didn't ask this question, but this is where I'm going with this, is to have fun with it. That was, I think, a lot of what a lot of people have enjoyed with my book, is that it emphasized having fun and not get caught up with yourself and your doubts and your worries, because you were gonna make good beer. That's what I assured you, which all of you know. Well, yeah, and I'll tell you one other perspective that for me personally, I still brew after all these years. I brew about once a month, and my system would probably surprise most of you. I don't have stainless steel fermenters or temperature controlled. I just wheel things into different areas of my garage to have different temperatures. I do have a walk-in cooler, but that's because I don't have a basement. It's a simple, my process is plastic bucket, sparging systems, lauter tons, a stainless 10-gallon stainless steel pot that sits on my stove or outside on a propane burner, which if the weather's nice. I'm ladling beer, I'm ladling mash from one vessel to another with a saucepan. I'm siphoning, no pumps. And the thing is, I keep it simple. As simple as I possibly can, because that just gives me more time to I can approach brewing and decide to brew, and it's not a big hassle for me. And I get into it for about 4 or 5 hours and knock out all grain brew, and I just enjoy the process of making beer still after all these years.
The future of homebrewing is plastic.
No, I wouldn't say that, but it's simple. It doesn't have to be sophisticated, and I understand that we all go in different directions. And for me, the simplicity is part of my directions, and I play with hops a lot. I don't play with yeast. Other people play with yeast. Other people play with gadgets. Other people play with equipment, hops, malt. I mean, there are all sorts of specialities that we can all focus on to continually evolve our education and enjoy the process. And for me, it's keeping it simple after all these years, so to enable my ability to keep brewing.
What's that go-to yeast, Charlie? What's that house strain?
It's that house strain. Actually, the long story short, if you ever read Microbrewed Adventures, you know the story. But it was a yeast given to me by Coors years ago when I was invited to brew some beer for the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, one of their meetings in St. Louis. So this was Anheuser-Busch people and Falstaff people across the river, and they asked me to brew a beer, and I shipped it out there, and they kegged it. Well, I put it in the kegs, they put it in cans. So it's literally the first craft beer ever brewed, put in cans. And I needed good yeast because in those days you either paid $100 for a slant that was shipped to you from Germany or the UK or Siebel Institute, or used dried yeast, and dried yeast was not very good in those days. So Coors unfroze one of their cultures and gave me a slant, a few, maybe 1 million cells worth of yeast, and I've kept that going for all these years since 1983.
What?
And after about
Yeah, give it up.
after about 25 years of using this lager yeast, which I use for all my ales and lagers and my imperial stouts and my barley wines and my light lagers and my pilsners, I've used the same yeast, and I've managed to learn how to make great tasting ales by temperature control and a number of other things. And nobody has ever commented to me that, boy, this doesn't taste like, my beer doesn't taste like an ale, or it doesn't taste like a lager. But it works. And after about 25, 30 years, there's two stories I want to tell. There was a bottle of 25-year-old double bock that I made. And Pete Johnson was visiting me. We made a beer, and I opened the bottle, and we tried it. It was a little bit oxidized, but it wasn't contaminated. It tasted like a good double bock with a little bit of oxidation, and I emphasize a little bit, not too bad. And then I was about to dump the dregs out, and Pete said, "Don't you sometimes culture up the dregs?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I do, and I intend to do this." So I cultured up the dregs out of a 25-year-old bottle of my Bock beer, and added wort, and nothing happened for 2 or 3 days. And after the 4th day, there was bubbles, and after the 5th day, it started fermenting, and I tasted the beer from it, and it tasted clean. So I cultured it up again, another cycle, and I took the plunge and I tried to brew. I brewed in a full 5-gallon batch, and it worked, and it tasted like the original. And after that, White Labs approached me and said, "Charlie, I hear that you've been brewing with this yeast. You want us to take a look at it?" And I said, "Sure." So I sent them a sample of the yeast. They looked at it and says, "It's pretty clean. It has no problems. We don't see any problems with it." And that blew me away, because I did have some spells of phenolic beers with that yeast. There was this plastic phenolic character. A wild yeast had gotten into it. So what I did was I put it aside. The beer was cultured on beer, or with beer, with a wort, and I just kept it in the refrigerator for a year or two. And I cultured it up again, and after 2 years, I cultured it up again, and that wild yeast had disappeared. It didn't survive, but this lager yeast did survive. And so it was clean again. That's how I clean it. My process accidentally processed it, and it became clean. No acid cleaning or anything like that. And it turns out that I never knew what that yeast was until one day one of my former homebrewing students became one of the head brewers at Sandlot Brewery, the Coors Brewery at Sandlot, the baseball stadium. And Wayne had said, I said, "Hey, Wayne, do you think you'd find out what this yeast was that I got, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, whatever?" And he says, "Yeah, do you have a number?" I said, "I actually do. I have it pinned to my bulletin board, the actual number." And he said, "I'll find out for you." And then 2 or 3 days later, he called me. He said, "Are you sitting down, Charlie?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm sitting down." That beer was actually cultured from a keg of Budweiser. So it was, I once mentioned this. I told this story, and I mentioned it there were a number of Anheuser-Busch people in the audience when I told this story previously. And I mentioned, well, that was probably the happiest Budweiser yeast ever, fermenting all those imperial stouts and barley wines and all these kinds of beers. And they didn't appreciate that comment.
It became a butterfly. I have two quick questions, and one is just totally like, I celebrate my 10th anniversary of homebrewing this November, and I've never thought about this. Why is 5-gallon the standard? Is it because those were the kegs available, or a fairly even bottle count, or were you just like, 5 gallons, let it be forever forth, the standard batch size of homebrew?
No, there's very good logic behind that. Before 5 gallons, my standard was 13.
Oh, man.
13 gallons, because that was the maximum you could fit into a 15-gallon trash pail. And that was, and, you know, homebrew retailers weren't very happy about my first book, because I would suggest, well, you can buy your bottle cappers at the hardware store, and you can go to, you know, whatever department store was in existence in those days, and buy your food-grade garbage pails and brew there. You know, they were very touchy about those kinds of things. They wanted all the homebrewers to buy their stuff from the homebrew shops. So when I wrote the Complete Joy of Home Brewing, it became 5 gallons, and I didn't really direct people to any particular store. Eventually there were enough homebrew supply stores where you didn't have to go to the department store to buy your equipment. But 5 gallons was the size of the carboys, the glass carboys that were available, in which we all fermented in. And then in the early Zymerges, people began accessing 5-gallon Cornelius soda canisters. And they were also 5 gallons. So that was a convenient transition from 5-gallon fermenters, glass fermenters, to, and then all of a sudden there were availability of 6.5-gallon carboys from the chemical industry. They shipped a lot of chemicals in those. So those were usually tossed out, or you could get them for $2 or $5 for a deposit, or the chemical things were for free. They were usually destroyed. So, and the Cornelius tanks, there was tons of those that were discarded. Box cars full of them that, you know, in our area that we got and were distributed to home brewers in the early days, because they replenished them with newer things, and they became slightly dented or damaged, and they didn't want to use them anymore. So 5 gallons was very convenient.
My second question, your system sounds very simple, which is awesome, and then you got brew in a bags, you got single tiers, triple tiers, pumps. Now you walk through the expo, and it's a mind-blowing, it's like Star Trek, automated, fairly automated, some hands-on. I personally believe there's a place for all of that, as long as the person using it is still interested in the art. Because we're still adding energy waves of homebrew awesomeness out there, even if you're not spending 5 hours. Would you agree with that, or where do you kind of feel that more button-pushing side falls into our spectrum of the hobby?
Well, I think it's really important, and that's kind of how I wrote my book, is for people to learn the fundamentals and not be intimidated by the important aspects of the science of brewing. And if you know the fundamentals of brewing, you can, you can troubleshoot virtually any system, whether it's a simple system that I have, or a Pico brew, or a stainless steel 3-tiered system. You can troubleshoot if you know the fundamentals and the basic science behind not only fermentation, but how liquid flows from one place to another, and how heat transfers itself, and how materials behave under stress or under different situations. So the thing is, all these different kinds of systems just present so many cool options, and that's one of the reasons why home brewing is so much more accessible now, because people live in different situations. If you live in a large city, New York City is a great example. People have small places and usually they have small apartments and they don't have a lot of room, and small little Pico, call them what you want, these small little countertop systems make home brewing accessible. And if nothing else, it teaches you to appreciate beer brewing and beer, and get excited and getting inside of what this beer culture is all about, and being able to relate to the brewery down the street. And that's important to and it's a very important reason as to why the beer culture in the United States has become what it is because there are a lot of knowledgeable people, and there's degrees of knowledge that people have. People in this room are probably some of the top most knowledgeable people about home brewing, but of the, let's say, million other people that are brewing beer in this country, there's all sorts of degrees of awareness, but just a little bit of awareness goes a long ways in appreciating what beer is all about and what's behind the beer making process, the people and the challenges and the rewards.
Yeah, the people we all idolize. I mean, pro brewers aren't running across garages with buckets sloshing. In the end game, if, say, you want to be a brewer, you're going to be learning a lot more about systems, automation, valves, but there's always still the temperature, the steps, the hops, the changing of variables. Maybe you actually get better at tweaking recipes when you're not as worried about, like, I never hooked up the garden hose to chill in the garage, so. Well,
you are wrong about brewers.
What?
Aren't
Never.
Running around in their brewery with buckets. They are, because
True.
more than ever before, even some of the largest breweries, they have their big system, and they used to have their 5-barrel small system, and now they have their 3-barrel, 1-barrel, and even their 5-gallon system. Very large breweries, because they're even when Coors was developing the Blue Moon, I remember Keith Villa, somebody I've known for many, many years. He's the guy who developed the recipe for that. He was brewing in 5-gallon homebrew corny kegs that he learned from what homebrewers were using. And he was doing in a room, I remember the room, it was about a 10-foot by 20-foot, call it a lab, whatever. It was where he was given a free rein to experiment with peanut butter beers and Belgian beers or whatever. But what I'm saying is that even the large craft brewers are really scaling down to really be able to innovate without stressing out the logistics of how their company works. You laughed. He said, yeah, where are you going to get the beer?
A festival's worth of great beer, right?
Yeah. And he was right. Where were we going to get the beer? I just knew we could figure it out. We just. But how we did figure it out was we sat. There's myself, Tom Burns, Stu Harris, and Frank Morris. Tom Burns was a brewmaster at the time at the Boulder Brewing Company, and the four of us schemed on how we were going to pull this off, and where were we going to get the beer? Well, Tom said he knew. He had been to a Brewers Association of America conference, and he had met a lot of these brewers, so he had an in, and that was an essential in as far as when we asked for beer. We actually got it because Tom was asking on our behalf. But how do we figure out what beers to invite? Well, the only book that we could find that had any information was one of these beer can books. Beer labels, a book that had beer labels in it and beer cans, and we went through that and we saw what people were brewing. And we said, we don't want your light lagers for the most part. We want your porters or stouts or whatever, or cream ales or darker beers or brown beers, whatever we could find. And there weren't very many. So the ones we asked for were either classics of American beer history or some specialties like Yingling. We knew they made a porter, so we asked them to send the porter. And they made an ale called Lord Chesterfield Ale. So we asked for their ale. I'd never tasted that. But, we didn't ask for their light lagers. 20 breweries in a room about this size. Wow. A room about this size.
How many categories? 168, right?
Yeah, right. We had, let's see. I used to be able to say this. Now we have, how many times? 5 times more beer at the beer festival than we had people at the first beer festival. We had about 700 people at the first beer festival. 20 breweries, 40 beers. yeah, like, I guess I'm a serial entrepreneur in a way. But that's what good homebrew and good beer does to you. It gets creative juices going.
Yep.
And you dream. You know, people always ask me, did you ever dream that the homebrew conference would be this way, or that the beer festival would have this many people, or that it would come to this? And I say, yeah, I dreamt it. I drank too much of my homebrew, and when you drink too much of your homebrew, you dream, man. But what I didn't think of was the impact that all this means to our lives.
Yep. We got 10 minutes. Is there any questions, or you want us to just keep rolling along here? Any questions for Charlie? Oh, yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, please use mine.
Probably 2-3 questions, depends how long the answers are.
Hey, so Charlie, this question's for you. If you read kind of the stories of Sam Calagione, of Ken Grossman, of Jim Cook, and they even talk about it themselves, they realize they've created these great empires, these great followings, and at some point they become kind of the inhibitors to the growth. At what point did you realize kind of you've set all these great things in motion and it was time to build greater support staff behind you?
Oh, I see what you point when you say inhibitors.
You're only one person.
Yeah, well, in those early days, we were living day to day. We didn't have a lot of finances at all. I think Charlie Mattson, my co-founder, and I put in about $2,000 each, and 4 years later we paid ourselves back gradually. But it was mostly a volunteer staff in the early days. And as soon as we could hire people, a marketing director was one of the first half-time hires. But yeah, it's really important to delegate. And I learned that, you just try to do everything yourself. And that's just, it's good to start out that way. It's good to have that background. And, I at one time did everything that everybody else does at the association in one way or another, but you got to delegate and let people create and harness those creative juices and create a work environment where people can think outside the box and grow themselves. And that's the other side of growing all this stuff. It's not only coming up with the ideas, but really putting into place an environment that people can participate. I think we take a lot of pride in that. The GABF has 3,000 volunteers, and there's a waiting list to be a volunteer because we make these events, and the participation, whether as a attendee or as a back of the house support staff or support volunteers, we really are always thinking about making that experience a learning experience, a fun experience, and a growing experience for whatever you're involved in. And that's, I think, a secret to all these craft brewers as well. The culture of their business is something that I have heard and discussed many, many, many times, and particularly in the interviews with these pioneer craft brewers, that culture of the business and the way they approach not only their business but life and their community is really what makes it possible for them to sustain their continued growth.
Cool. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I've noticed over the years, I've been following you since the early 90s when I first started brewing in college, but I noticed over the years that you've remained noticeably independent and relatively non-commercial, but I'm sure over the years that you've been approached by various companies or entities asking you for endorsements of products or things. And do you have any amusing pitches that you've received that you would like to share, or your most,
Cringeworthy?
Yes.
People have it. I think they really understand my position and know that I really can't endorse products necessarily or be a spokesperson for a product. So, I go out on limbs sometimes and reviewing beers for publications like All About Beer and things like that. But You notice my byline doesn't mention that I was president of the Brewers Association, or now, as long as I'm still working for the association, I really feel there's too much of a conflict of interest to get involved in that. And the question on everybody's mind is, have I ever thought of starting a brewery? Yes, of course I've thought about it. That's why I'm not doing it. Yeah.
Why ruin a great hobby? All right, Mark.
Yeah. Real quick question, Charlie. When you signed that first contract with, you said Avon for
Yeah.
Joy of Brewing, what were your expectations for what that book would become?
Well, my first reaction was, oh shit, I gotta write this thing now. Because that material didn't exist. And I had only these very technical books to go by and my experiences. With a vision, it was very, very, very clear. And maybe you can relate if you read my stories and my articles. I'm always writing things with the perspective of the person and you people, whoever's going to read this. You need to understand, enjoy the reading, relate to it. I avoid using acronyms. If there's a technical process, I don't necessarily assume that you understand everything about it, because there's all kinds of levels of knowledge of brewing. So I want everybody to have access to understanding beer. And that was, the early vision and the early driving goal of the American Homebrewers Association and all the things we did was making beer information accessible to the public. That was what drove us. Everything we did in those early days, because in those early days there was nothing except $100 book textbooks that were speaking a different language. I mean, they were very technical, and you really couldn't. The average person couldn't understand what these books were about. And so it was just making this information that was out there accessible, and that's basically that's my approach when I started writing this book. I wanted to make it fun, and I wanted to make every bit of what I said at least understandable. You could disagree, but understandable.
Okay. Hey, thanks so much.
We just have a few minutes. I have a couple of notes that I'm going to make after the fact, but first, let's show our appreciation for Tom and Charlie for waking up and being here.
Here on the back end of that wonderful interview, I just wanted to give one more shout out to Charlie Papazian. Clearly, happy birthday. Thank you for making me a part of that very fun interview session. Shout out to Tom Dalldorf as well. Guy is a fountain of information and experience in craft beer. Check out Celebrator Beer News for more from him and his crew. Also, shout out to Matt Bowling and everybody at the American Homebrewers Association for letting us ride the coattails of that video. I had a great time listening back to it and watching it again. It was a really early seminar, so it's kind of like watching it for the first time or living it for the first time. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for supporting Chop and Brew. We got new ways for you to support us coming out soon, and we hope to get you some really good content connected to that. But until then, chop for chop, brew for brew. Relax, don't worry. Have a home brew.